good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. My name is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're delighted to welcome our good friend, longtime friend, Ian Rankin, with us today. He's going to be talking about his long-awaited new Rebus novel we've all been waiting for, Midnight in Blue. And it just so happens that today is the 35th anniversary of the Poison Pen Bookstore. So Barbara started this business at a tiny little shop around the corner back in 1989. And it's amazing. It's amazing how it's grown over the years. It's a real testament to Barbara, really. I mean, she has put a lot of sweat equity into this business over the years.
Well, thank you, Patrick, but it's also a testament to Ian because we've been together doing stuff since I think 1990 or maybe 91. When was it you came to the Seattle BoucherCon, Ian?
Oh, I can't remember. It's so long
Oh,
ago.
it's so long ago.
My abiding memory of the Seattle BoucherCon was queuing at the bar, and there was a guy behind me, and I got chatting to him, and he said, "Oh, by the way, my name's Jim Crumley," and I said, "No, no, no, I know what Jim Crumley looks like. You ain't him." And this guy came over and said, "Yes, this man is." It was like something out of a Woody Allen movie. This guy had to come over and say, "Yes, this man really is James Crumley." Uh, I was a big fan of his books, and suddenly there I am talking to him at the bar.
I love it. So I ran into some people of whom Ian was one, and they issued me a challenge, and they said, you're the only person here we think might know who this guy is. And the reason I knew who this guy is that Diana Gabaldon had been buying his books written as Jack Harvey for a long time because she was a customer at the store. So I did know who Ian was. It was so great. We've had lots of adventures together ever since. We've had coffee together in Edinburgh. We've had dinner in London. He's been here to visit. It's been a wonderful relationship. So who better to do our first birthday event than Ian? So thank you, Ian, for agreeing.
And thank you for introducing me to Diana Gabaldon at a Highland Games near your bookstore. The first time I met her, you put us both in a little booth for Poison Pen, and we had to sit there while all these people dressed in kilts, wielding claymore swords, wandered past. It was
including one Ian Rankin, if I'm not
moment.
mistaken.
Huh?
I said, including one Ian Rankin, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't you?
Yeah,
Barbara
I definitely had the kilt.
Yeah.
Do you know, one of my fondest memories of Ian is that I nagged him to come to the store and wear a kilt. And for some reason or other, I brought our dog, our first dog, Casey, who was an absolute steam sealer. So Casey leapt up into the chair and took over, and Ian said to me, "Only you," he said, "would upstage me when I've come in my kilt with a dog." Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of adventures down the years, a lot of adventures. But I'm glad the store is thriving. And I mean, as Patrick says, it's all down to your hard work and your skill and your passion for this genre, for these writers and these books. So from all of us, happy birthday to the Poison Pen.
Well, thank you, Ian. I want to say that Patrick, who has been part of this for 32 years, I think deserves equal credit. The store, Patrick is the real bookseller in the store.
30.
Has it been 30?
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know how we'd function without him. So what I've done, since this is a preview, Midnight in Blue does not actually publish in the UK or the US until October 15th. So we are doing this as a preview event. And since we can't show you a book, I went into my personal archive and I brought out two Ian Rankin books that many of you have probably never seen. They're not the actual novels, but the first one is called Death Is Not the End, published in 1998. Do you remember this, Ian?
Yeah, it was a novella.
That's right.
It's
novella, part of the Criminal Records series of novellas. I think Otto Penzler, actually another bookseller, edited this series, didn't he?
Yeah, he commissioned it. He said, "Have you got anything that is novella length?" He was going to do this series. I mean, he did start a series. I'm not sure how many were in it eventually, but so I did a Rebus, kind of long short story involving Rebus, Death Is Not the End, which is a Bob Dylan song, but covered by Nick Cave on his album Murder Ballads. That was how I knew it, and that was how I got the title. But I liked the story so much, I couldn't bear for it just to be released as a novella in the States and in the UK latterly. So I cannibalized it in the good old phrase of Raymond Chandler. And quite a lot of it ended up in my novel. I think it was Dead Souls, has a big old chunk of Death Is Not the End wedged into it.
Wonderful. Well, anyway, I treasure it, autographed by Ian. And then I still don't know whether you're ever going to write a memoir, but when this one published in 2005 called Rebus's Scotland, Ian Rankin, A Personal Journey, you kind of indicated this might be as close as you were going to come to some sort of memoir.
Yeah, I mean, that started off with two photographers who were in the employ of the University of Edinburgh. And I can't remember if it was an interview or if I'd written a short story for the university's magazine for its graduates and alumni. And they sent these photographers along to take a nice spooky photograph of me in a graveyard. And I liked it so much, I showed it to my publishers in London, and they said, "This is terrific." And they started using Ross and Trish, the two photographers. They started using them for my jackets for a good chunk of the middle of the Rebus series. And then he said, "Ian, we think it'd be fun to put together a book of photographs of Rebus's Scotland, the places you write about in your books. Would you like to write little paragraphs to go with the photographs?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'd like to do a little bit more than that. I can use this as a springboard to do answers to frequently asked questions about Rebus's musical taste, about where the character came from, his upbringing, about, what the themes of the books are, politics in Scotland, society, how I see Scottish literature and whether Rebus fits into that overarching genre." All of that. So we had this book called Rebus Scotland, and the copy you've got there, the hardcover, is very rare because when they did eventually publish it as a scaled back mass market paperback, they only used half the photographs. So the copy you've got, the hardcover, is the only one that has all the photographs in it. And it's quite sad, quite poignant for me because a couple of the photographs feature a guy called John Gates. John Gates was the owner of the Oxford Bar when I began drinking there as a student. John retired, but he then passed away a few years ago. And then there's a lovely photograph of the woman who used to cut my hair in the village where I grew up.
Yeah.
She still had her hairdresser's shop and she was still working there. And he got a photograph of her, June Jarvis, her name was. And again, sadly, she's also passed away. So when I look at that book, I don't get maudlin, but
Yeah.
it does send me reeling back through the years.
Well, I imagine so, since I mean, it's been 19 years, coming up on 20. I love the photographs. This is one, not of the Oxford Bar, but of a different drinking
Yeah.
establishment. And I really love the photograph on the back. Unfortunately, since I have a
Yeah,
muffler on,
you've,
it's
you've
not
got a
going
lacquered, you've got a lacquer protection on it, which is
I
great.
do. Well, that's why it's still in good shape, Ian.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I've got a hardcover copy of that. I'm gonna have to go and look on the shelves. I think I gave all mine away.
Well, when Ian published the 30th Rebus novel, there was a big commotion in the UK, and Ian was the guest of honor at BasherCon that year. So he was coming to the US. So he sent me an email and asked what were we going to do, and we put together one of my very favorite conferences we ever did. We put together an Ian Rankin conference at the Arizona Biltmore, and is one of the real sadnesses of my book-selling life that we didn't record the conversation that James Salas, a remarkable writer who lives here, the conversation between Jim and you. But I can remember many people were so moved by it that they were in tears. And Hank Felipe Ryan, who'd come out to be part of it, and I sat over by a pillar and we kind of, let tears. It was really inspirational, and I know that you didn't do it from notes, and so there's no way we could ever reproduce it. And I'm sad that we didn't record it better.
Well, I'm sad, but also I like that. I mean, I grew up at a time when, events that you attended were precious because you didn't record them. There
Yeah.
was no way of going back. You only held them in your memory and you held them close. You hugged them because they were only there in your memory. Great concerts I went to that were never recorded, book events I did that were never recorded, conversations with people. I mean, Patrick took me to James Salas's house on one trip and we just sat there drinking, listening to jazz and chatting for a few hours. And that was precious because it was of the moment. It
Right.
was the moment. And sometimes when something is off the moment, that's when the real magic happens. Like you've just talked about, you get a very emotional conversation. And if somebody knew they were being recorded, they might be a little bit more guarded in what they said, or they
It's
might be
hard for me to believe
less.
that you would ever be guarded, but
Oh, this day and age, with people getting cancelled left,
yeah.
right, and center, I think, writers like everybody else in the media and in the public eye possibly are a little bit more cautious than they used to. I have this conversation all the time. I'm 64 years old. I have this conversation all the time with friends of mine of the same age who all went to school together. We say we're so thankful we grew up in a time before everybody's phone was also a camera. Because some of the shenanigans that we got up to, you're just thankful that there is no record of that.
I'm sure you're right. I mean, I can give you 20 years and I feel the same way. But what I do remember was that you weren't so much talking about Rebus and your own career, is that you did a wonderful conversation about Scottish literature. And all, do you remember that, Patrick? I mean,
Oh
it was,
yeah, very well. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, there
absolutely.
was nothing in it that anyone could have objected to, but it was just it was one of those sort of literary highlights. It was less about you and Rebus and much more about your really breathtaking acquaintance with literature, Ian. And you are a real scholar as well as a writer.
Well, that journey continues for me. I think in February this year, my wife and I were on a cruise. It was a strange kind of cruise. We flew to San Francisco and jumped on a cruise ship, and our final destination was Auckland, New Zealand. So we were on a cruise ship all the way across the Pacific, and there were only three stops. There was Honolulu, Fiji, and Samoa. So we were at sea for 20 odd days. It's when I did all the editing and the second draft of the new book, Midnight in Blue, was at sea, all these sea days with nothing to do except write. But as part of that, on our stop in Samoa, I was able to finally pay homage to Robert Louis Stevenson, one of my favorite writers, Edinburgh born, great crime writer. Jekyll and Hyde is a fantastic crime story. But he spent his last 4 years in Samoa
Yeah, yeah.
on a kind of in a plantation house with his whole family, and it's now a museum. And so my wife Miranda said, "What do you want to do with your one day in Samoa?" I said, "We've got to jump in a cab. We've got to go to Robert Louis Stevenson's plantation house. We've got to look around it." After we'd done that, the guide said, "If you want, you can climb up this very steep, high hill to his mausoleum." And Miranda said, "No, I'm just going to stay at the bottom." It was very hot, very humid, um, middle of the day. And I thought, yeah, I'll just go for it. I didn't take any water with me. I had no head cover with me. Typical, working class Scot, off I go. And after about 45 minutes of climbing, I thought I was going to die. I thought, you might as well just bring another coffin up here and plant me next to Robert Louis Stevenson because I don't think I can make this. Anyway, I'll show you the photograph someday. I did make it to the top, and after cursing him loudly for several minutes for not being buried at sea level or having the good grace to be buried in Edinburgh, I then had a nice few minutes just alone at Robert Louis Stevenson's mausoleum. And, along with a few other a few other Scottish writers, he, he kick-started my writing career. He kick-started my journey towards crime fiction.
There'd been a certain sort of splendid symbolism had you died at Robert Louis Stevenson's too. Maybe they would have buried you alongside, and then there would have been regular pilgrimages.
It's all material, Barbara. It will make it into a short story or something one of these days.
Of course it
You've,
will.
you've always you've always championed Muriel Spark too. And
Yeah.
I think, sort of led a lot of us to go back and investigate her stuff more fully, which is what I did.
It was hard to
Yeah,
lose
and she
Maggie
she was a
Smith.
strange and wonderful writer as well. And again, I made a TV documentary about her life for her centenary of her birth. And I was able to go to her gravestone, which is in on the outskirts of a little village in Italy, not too far from Rome. And that was quite moving as well. I only ever met her once. I've got the photographic evidence here. I met her one time. She came to the Edinburgh Book Festival the year before she died. She was old. She was quite frail. I went with 2 shopping bags full of first editions, and I got the chance to meet her and sit with her. But I just plucked out The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, first edition, and said, "Will you sign that to me, please?" Which she duly did. I think it is still my favorite book of hers. It's a very short, very complicated book,
And it
which
connects
got its
back to
first
Stevenson.
yeah, it does, but it got its first publication in the New Yorker. In a single issue of the New Yorker around 1960-61, you could read the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie from start to finish. That's how slender a book it is. But it contains multitudes. It's much bigger on the inside than the outside. It's like Doctor Who's TARDIS. And yeah, it harks back to William Brodie, who was a real person. He was a deacon of rights, like a carpenter, but he was very well known in Edinburgh. He was very cultured and successful and a member of polite society, but he was also a burglar. He would break into your house of an evening because he had probably made the keys for it. And he had a gang, and they merrily burgled and hit people over the head, and some of them even died. And he was eventually unmasked and was hanged on a scaffold that he had built, that he had crafted himself as a carpenter. And Robert Louis Stevenson, when he was a kid and he was ill and he was sickly in his bedroom at home, had a wardrobe that had been made by Brodie. And his nursemaid would tell him the story of this guy who was both good and evil contained in the same person. And that wardrobe, if you ever come to Edinburgh, is now in the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh. You can see the wardrobe that I think inspired the very young Robert Louis Stevenson to eventually write Jekyll and Hyde, and then inspired Muriel Spark to write Miss Jean Brodie, who tells us she is descended from a gentleman called William Brodie.
That's an amazing story. What did you think of Maggie Smith in the movie? I was, she just died, and they've
Yeah,
had many, there's been a lot of talk about her role.
yeah. I mean, she was phenomenal in it, and she got an Oscar for it. She was terrific, and they filmed a lot of it on location in Edinburgh. I mean, I walk up and down the steps when she takes her girls for a walk into the kind of rougher parts of Edinburgh. The steps that they walk down, which have now been renamed the Jean Brodie Steps. I walk down those steps pretty much every week on my way to the Oxford Bar. It's halfway between my apartment and the Oxford Bar, and I always think of Jean Brodie, and especially the film where she's taking her girls on a little day trip around the city of Edinburgh. She was a great actress, and of course, then what did she do? She retooled Miss Jean Brodie for the character of Miss McGonagall in the Harry Potter movies. I mean, she is really just Jean Brodie grown old.
I hadn't thought of that, but I certainly see your point. Absolutely. Well, maybe we got to talk about Midnight Blue here just for a few minutes. And I will say this, that in order to really fully appreciate it, you probably should have read Ian's 2023 novel. I hope I always get this wrong. It's A Heart Full of Headstones.
Heart Full of Headstones.
Right. And without telling you why, it sets up the situation that Rebus finds himself in Midnight in Blue. So
Yeah.
is this your first attempt at is this your first execution of a locked room mystery?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I love the genre. I love the kind of subgenre in crime fiction of the locked room mystery. And of course, Edgar Allan Poe was one of the early adherents of it in a way with Murders in the Rue Morgue. Um, and yeah, when it's done well, it's fascinating. But it came about in a kind of weird way. What happened was, as you say, Heart Full of Headstones, I thought was going to be a very fitting end to the series. Rebus ends that book on trial for murder. It's like his Reichenbach falls moment. Is he going to fall, or is he, or what? The judge is about to pronounce sentence, the book ends. It's not much of a spoiler. Um, but then I thought, well, it could be the end of the series, but fans disagreed heartily and vociferously. They said, no, no, we need to know what happens next. What happened at the end of that courtroom scene? And I thought, well, what did happen? Well, he's probably found guilty. Oh, if he's found guilty, he goes to jail. Oh, if he's in jail, he's surrounded by people who hate him and probably want him dead because he's an ex-cop. And he probably put some of them inside and they don't like him. Interesting. So now we've got immediately from the get-go, you've got drama and tension. You've got Rebus up against it in a big way. And then I thought, well, what happens if there's a murder in the prison? And it's a murder that couldn't have happened or shouldn't have happened. It's a locked cell mystery. And again, it's not really a spoiler because it happens in the first few pages of the book. Suddenly, who are they going to turn to? Who has the nous to solve a locked cell mystery? John Rebus. So that's his role. While having to watch his back because there are so many people around him who want him dead, he's trying to solve this crime to stop the prison exploding, because all the prisoners think a member of staff must have done it, and all the staff think it must have been one of the prisoners. So the two sides are up against each other, and the place is like a powder keg. And Rebus is the only person who can stop it from exploding. So I just thought, this is great. I've got to write this book. So then I thought, well, I better go to jail. And I was very lucky. A friend of mine, who's quite a well-known photographer in Edinburgh, used to be a prison guard, and he introduced me to someone who introduced me to someone who introduced me to someone, and eventually I got to the governor of Edinburgh Prison, and he was about to retire, and he said, "Yeah, come in, have a little tour of the place." And he was quite unguarded, if you'll pardon the pun, because he was about to retire, and so I got some great information. And I was able to talk to prisoners and staff of all stripes. And I thought, yep, this is, I think this could work. This could work. But it's an incredibly claustrophobic environment. And luckily, when I said to the governor, so if there's a murder in the jail, who investigates? And he went, well, cops, CID, detectives would come in from the outside. And I thought, great. Now I've got the outside world coming in here, and then those cops going back out into the outside world. So suddenly it's a less oppressive atmosphere for the reader. And Rebus, of course, is between the two. He's trying to keep in touch with the outside world while very much trapped on the inside. Has that whetted your appetite?
I thought it was amazing. And my first thought was that you must have spent some time in the jail. It's not just the claustrophobia, it's stuff like, how everybody smells, and, there's no privacy. And what happens if there's a lockdown? Does anybody get anything decent to eat? And, what kind of people are the guards? What brings people, to work as prison guards? And how susceptible are they to corruption? And Patrick has read a lot more prison literature than I have. So, the prevalence of smuggled phones and drugs and all the things that you would think can't actually be brought into a prison. I loved it when he dug a phone out of the drain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for a long time, they used to say, oh, there's no drugs in jails in Scotland. There's no drugs in prisons. But then they had to put their hands up and say, yeah, drugs get in. How do they get in? Myriad ways. I mean, in Edinburgh specifically, it's got a very high wall and then just kind of waste ground around the high wall. People would come with catapults and just launch little bags of coke or whatever, heroin or something, just launch them over the wall. 9 times out of 10, probably a guard would intercept them. But 1 time in 10, a prisoner might be walking by, scoop it up, bingo. And then, there's been a lot of stories in the media down the years of prison officers and staff, ancillary staff who've been bribed or threatened. So they start bringing stuff in. They get in relationships with prisoners. There's a lot of, all human life is there, Barbara. All human life is there. It's a kind of microcosm for the society at large. And I just absolutely was fascinated by the place and by the rules, not the rules inflicted on the prisoners by the guards and by the system, but the rules the prisoners make for themselves, the hierarchy. And there really is a hierarchy. There's one really nice little joke in the book that came about completely by accident. Having delivered the book, my publisher said to me, you don't really describe what they wear very much, Ian. Could you do a bit more description of what the prisoners wear? And I'd sort of forgotten, from my visit. So I got in touch with the governor again, and he said, we've got, if they're in their own hall, their own wing, they can wear what they like. If they're going to other parts of the prison, we need to know what kind of prisoner we're dealing with. Or if they're going outside the prison, we need to know what kind of prisoner we're dealing with. So their tops will be color coded. And I mean, this is a very Edinburgh joke. I said, well, what's the color coding? And there were half a dozen maybe. But he said life prisoners, people who've committed murder and very serious crimes, wear green, which happens to be the colors of the local football team, Hibernian. He said sex offenders wear maroon, which happens to be the colors of Hibernian's opposition in Edinburgh, Heart of Midlothian. So I said, who came up with this color scheme that one football team are the kind of good guys in a way, and one football team are the terrible guys? He said, well, obviously it was a Hibernian football fan. So a previous governor several generations back, who was a fan of Hibernian and hated the opposition, made sure that the sex offenders were dressed in the colours of the team he hated. And if you go to other prisons in Scotland, it's the opposite way around. So sometimes the maroon will be the life prisoners, and green will be the sex offenders or whatever. It's just one of those little jokes that the authorities have because they can. And so as soon as I found that out, bang, that has to go in the book, even if it makes no sense at all to an American audience.
Well, it wasn't that it didn't make sense, but I really enjoyed it when at one point, Rebus has to grab a thin, I think you described it as a thin green sweatshirt or a jersey
Yeah.
or something, and haul it down over his regular clothes in order to go off and do something. Patrick, while I quell the dogs, which I need to do, talk to Ian
Yeah.
about prisons for a moment.
Yeah, no, I have some real questions about that. It's amazing that they put like the pedos and the sex offenders in maroon, which means they're, instantly identifiable to everybody, and I'm sure targeted accordingly. Um,
Well, that's one of the things, Patrick, is that would mean that they can go, oh no, these guys can't go out into the free flow area where different types of prisoners will mix or different wings will mix. They can't go out because the green guys are coming. So wait until the green guys have gone and the coast is clear. So everybody's watching this on CCTV, and they'll say, okay, now you can unlock the doors and let the maroon guys through because the coast is clear. There's no green guys who are going to attack them.
Right. I was also curious, because here, of course, murders happen in prison all the time, every day. Um, and unless I'm not paying attention, there's very little coverage of them.
Hmm.
And at least here in the media, unless it's a big, riot or something like that. But I've always been curious about, what you're starting to say about how those murders are actually investigated. Is the same amount of attention and police work placed on them, or are they just kind of uh, it's probably different in Europe than it is here.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the feeling that the general prison population have is that the authorities aren't too interested. They're not going to bust a gut trying to
Right.
solve this crime because it's one bad person killing it. It's like if gangsters kill each other on the outside.
Right.
You get a kind of territorial thing, and suddenly a gangster gets stabbed or shot. You think, well, the general population think, well, the police aren't going to work too hard to solve that. But in a prison, you need to solve it because otherwise the place is going to erupt. So you need to find out who did it. And also I think the detectives, it's such an unusual case for detectives to get that they will be motivated to actually do some work on it because it's just a fresh, different angle on a kind of crime that they're used to dealing with. And when you go into the jail, unlike most visitors, they can take their cell phones with them, but they have to be very careful because those cell phones cannot fall into the hands of the prisoners. And they will be counted in and counted out of the jail. I mean, as a visitor, I had to hand mine over. You put them in a locker and everything, and you couldn't take a cell phone anywhere near the jail. I was there last week. I went back to His Majesty's Prison Edinburgh last week to give a talk to some of the prisoners, and I was watching as they came in to see which colours they were wearing. There were a few greens, there were no maroons.
So there must be tons of Ian Rankin fans within prison. I'm sure they knew who you were, or a lot of them did. What was
Well,
that?
the reason I went in before the book is published, that I thought once they read the book, they might not be quite as happy to see me because neither the officers nor the prisoners might like what I've said about them. And although the book, although I've done my research and there's a lot of factual stuff in the book, it is a work of fiction and there are shortcuts I've had to take and there are things I've invented that probably don't happen and maybe even couldn't happen. Let me give you a quick example of that. The governor said to me very early on, when we were having our first conversation. He said, look, he said, you know, if someone like Rebus came to my jail, I would be actively trying to get him moved to a different jail in a different part of Scotland so that he wasn't meeting potentially people who wanted to kill him. And he said if he was in here, he would be put in a special wing with prisoners who have to be kept away from the general prison population. And I said, well, I don't want either of those to be the case. So I start the book with Rebus in this kind of special wing, very segregated wing. But then I find a way to get him into the general population. So in that respect, the book is slightly unrealistic. A real Edinburgh detective would probably not end up in the Edinburgh prison for their own protection.
And there are different levels of security too, right? There are maximum security prisons and minimum and so forth, right?
Yeah, it's not quite the way it is in the States. We don't have much in the way of maximum security prisons. The ones that we did have pretty much been changed or closed. We've got open prisons and things for lower level criminals. We've got prisoners for young offenders or kind of centres for young offenders. But somewhere like, I mean, I don't really mention it, but in Edinburgh, one wing is women. But of course, they never mix. So I didn't have any use for the women's wing at all. So although I've got women women prison officers, we don't ever go to the women's wing. But for very serious criminals, I mean, they do tend to, unless they've got psychiatric issues, in which case there is a special hospital called Carstairs, where serial killers often end up, or sort of, you know, multiple rapists might end up because they've got serious psychological conditions. But you know, you'll get gangsters in the general prison population in Edinburgh and elsewhere, and they pretty much run the place. And that is the case in my book. Is that there's a young gangster who a few books ago ended up in jail, Darrell Christie. And so he's back again because suddenly he's cheek by jowl with a certain John Rebus.
Indeed, he is. Now, you know what? We haven't talked about the fact that Rebus's old team, they're not in the jail, but they have some role to play in this book, and that means there's a different case going on that Siobhan and other people are investigating. The person that really takes the hit in this book, and you created him, so I sort of wondered, how can you dislike Malcolm Fox as much as you do?
Yeah, I've gone through periods when I liked Malcolm Fox. I mean, when I first invented him in the first two books, I quite liked him. But then I brought Rebus back, and I knew that Malcolm constitutionally would not like Rebus or the kind of cop that Rebus represents because he's a natural maverick and a rule breaker. And Malcolm is not. He's a cop who investigates other cops for misdemeanors and tries to take them down. He mistrusts all other cops. So then he suddenly had to become the baddie because fans of the series were on the side of Rebus, so they couldn't be on the side of Malcolm Fox. And he's tried to be like Rebus. He's tried to break the rules. He's no good at it. He's really just a desk jockey. That's his gift to the world. But he's not happy with that, so he always tries to get involved, and it never works out well for him. I think he's like a kind of slightly sad character whose ego overrides his abilities, and that is coming back to bite him big time. So yeah, so he plays a role in this book. Siobhan Clarke is in this book. There's a missing person. A schoolgirl has gone missing, as occasionally happens, and so it's just a missing persons case. But Siobhan also regularly visits Rebus during visiting time at the jail. And so she's bringing that case into Rebus to pick his brains and see what his take on it is. And her colleague, one-time colleague, Christine Essen, is one of the cops involved in the murder case in the prison. And Siobhan and Christine are still very close. So they get together and discuss their cases, and then they're in touch with Rebus. So you get this lovely kind of, triangle where two cops on the outside of the jail and one cop on the inside of the jail are keeping in regular contact and helping each other as much as possible. And of course, Rebus is a little bit wistful because when he does get access to a phone and phones them up, they're on the outside. He can hear rain. he knows they've just been to the pub, or they're just about to go out for a meal, or they're driving around in their car, and he's stuck in this kind of 8 feet by 6 feet room. Um, and that's when he really feels it. That's when he feels the tug of the outside world, and he wishes he was out there as well.
So you haven't mentioned that he's actually serving a life sentence, although in theory, there's an appeal.
Oh,
So,
I mean, yeah, I mean, he's appealing nonstop. I mean, from the minute he was put in jail, he would be appealing. There's no doubt about it.
yep.
And very frustrated that the appeal isn't getting anywhere and that his lawyers don't seem to be doing much and they seem to be shuffling along slowly. So he's definitely frustrated by that. But on the other hand, there are aspects of prison that he quite likes.
Like,
I mean, when he's on the outside, when he goes home at night, he's on his own. He sits on his own in one room and he listens to music and he reads books. And he's not really a gregarious person. He's not hosting parties or going out with all his mates because he has no mates. So prison in a way suits him quite well, and it has a rigid routine. And I think Rebus reacts well to a routine, because without that, his life has been chaos. It's why he joined the police, was so that his life would have a routine. It would have a shape and a form that otherwise would have meant he might have gone off his head. Same thing with the army. Joining the army straight after school was so there was a routine. So prison suits him in quite a lot of ways. It's just that he wishes when he gets bored that he could just open the door and go outside.
right. And they're also taking care of him medically because, we remember that he has breathing issues. And so in prison, they're obliged to make sure that all that's taken care of. So from a technical standpoint, Ian, just following one case might make for kind of a thin book. So does it work out best to, have this other case and other team so you can braid them together and, expand the novel?
I think it would have been a short novel. I think it would have been a good novel, but a short novel. I think it would have been very claustrophobic, and that would have made it difficult for the reader. I think it's great when you sort of go outside and you can relax a little bit. You're out in the open air. Um, and then you go back into the jail again, and suddenly it's very tense and claustrophobic. I do like the way that switches like that. So that worked for me. And often that's the way my books are. My books start very simple and then they get more complex as they go on. I mean, as you know, I make it up as I go along a lot of the time. I don't do a lot of pre-planning.
Right.
So, I never know how these plots are going to work out and if one might connect to another. And in my head, when I start thinking about a book, it's always very straightforward and linear. And when I start writing it, suddenly a tangent arrives, another tangent arrives, a subplot arrives, a character arrives. You're interesting. Let me do more with you. This subplot's not that interesting. Let's shove that to one side. And the book eventually finds its direction and leads me towards the finish line. It's really interesting the way I don't really know how a book is going to end until I'm very close to the end. But that famous doctoral quote, Yale doctoral quote about writing being like driving a car at night with the fog lamps on. You can't see much further than the lamps, but if you keep going, you'll get to your destination.
Now, Patrick, what would you like to ask? I know you haven't had a chance to read the book because it
No,
only
but this is,
existed digitally for me.
I don't want it to get into too many spoilers. This is a great setup. I can't wait to read it. One of the things, I mean, there are a bunch of stuff I'd like to ask him, but one of the things that really struck with me that you said, Ian, at one point, you said that writing was a way for you to deal with things that bothered you, or that, things, it helped you sort out things you know, that bothered you. True?
Yeah, I mean, I did an interview with the BBC recently. I'm juggling a lot of balls at the moment. I've got a play that's touring, a stage play, a Rebus stage play that's touring, which is slightly different Rebus. It's not long after he retired. That's the world of that Rebus. The TV, we're looking at trying to get season 2 underway. So there's a lot of work going on with that. And then the novel's coming out. So I've got all these different Rebuses in my head. But I think for the play, I was interviewed by the BBC, the broadcaster over here in the UK, and they teased from me the one thing that was the headline when the interview went live was a throwaway line, as I thought. That I got into crime fiction possibly because my mum died when I was very young. Um, my mum got ill literally the week that I arrived at Edinburgh University as a student, aged 18. Like a week later, I was having to go home because she wasn't well. And she then spent the next 6 to 9 months going downhill. And so my first year at university as an undergraduate, I was sort of in Edinburgh trying to be a cultured, civilized writer. I was going to be a poet and everything else. I was smoking gitan cigarettes and writing love poetry and stuff. And then at weekends, going home and being a son again, a working class son in a kind of council house in a coal mining village. And so I was a kind of Jekyll and Hyde uh, myself. And the stuff I wrote got darker, progressively darker and darker as my mum's health declined. And in some ways, that led me to Jekyll and Hyde. It led me to Muriel Sparks, Jean Brodie, and her other dark, crystalline books. It led me to a book called Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which is one of the very first serial killer novels and was an influence on Jekyll and Hyde. And it led me to Rebus. It led me to writing very dark, Gothic stories about the city where I happened to find myself, which was Edinburgh. So maybe what was a throwaway line to me became a big thing for the BBC, and I think maybe they did hit on something. That kind of thread of darkness has always been in the books, and the books have always been a way of me dealing with dark stuff in my life.
Going back and rereading, I read Jekyll and Hyde not too long ago, and I hadn't read it in years and years. And it was a totally different book than I remembered. Reading it at this stage in middle age,
Yeah.
and as opposed to when I was in my 20s. And it seems to me such a central book in our literature, this slim little masterpiece. And so much of really good, certainly a lot of crime fiction deals with the shadow, the shadow side.
Absolutely. I mean, The Killer Inside Me
Right.
is classic Jekyll and Hyde. All these sort of apparent sort of goodies who on the surface are fine and upstanding civilized human beings, but are hiding dark secrets and will do anything to stop those secrets being revealed. Jekyll and Hyde. Unreliable
Breaking
narrators.
Bad.
Jekyll and Hyde. Breaking Bad. Jekyll and Hyde. I mean, it's there. It's really there. But Jekyll and Hyde didn't come from nowhere. Jekyll and Hyde came from a lot of places, and one of them was Brodie, William Brodie, we've talked about. But there was also a doctor, Dr. Hunter, who was a Scottish doctor who worked in London, and he experimented on the recently deceased. So he was having body snatchers dig up bodies from the graveyards and bring them to him so he could do experiments on them. And his home was on what is now Leicester Square, right slap bang in the middle of Theatreland in London, which is pretty much where, if you read Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Jekyll's surgery is. So Stevenson must have known about this guy. So yeah, there's a lot going on. All this dark stuff, this Gothic stuff has been meat and drink to crime writers because we're dealing with the same thing. We're dealing with a big question of morality, of good and evil, of why human beings keep doing terrible things. And those are easy questions to ask. And as we are finding out as writers, very difficult questions to answer fully. And every time I pick up a pen or get started on a keyboard, I'm coming back to that central question. Why do we human beings keep doing terrible things?
So when in the early 90s, let's say late 80s, early 90s, when all this is kind of gestating, you meet a guy named Robin Cook, aka Eric Raymond. I always like to ask you about him.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't meet Robin Cook often. He lived in France, and I was mostly living in London at that time. But he came over to London to do events and to hang out. Very louche character. He's got the same intense, piercing eyes as Keith Richards. I met Keith Richards once, but you look into his eyes and you think, you've seen some stuff. There's a multitude in there. And it was the same with Robin Cook. This guy had lived several lives, many lives. But he was I remember when we moved to France, my wife and I, we lived in southwest France, and we got a television. And one night I was watching TV like 11 o'clock at night, and there's a chat show. And on this chat show, up pops Robin Cook with his beret and his cigarette, and he's speaking perfect French. He lived in Paris mostly in those days. Uh, and I just thought, wow, this guy is a celebrity in Europe, and he was almost unknown in the UK. And yes, he wrote these incredibly dark Jacobean tragedies with horrible, horrible characters in them, um, but beautifully written, poetically written. And he came from the upper classes. He was very well educated, but he'd gone off course, as it were, and had traveled and done a lot of drugs and been involved in nefarious activities, criminal activities. But a wonderful storyteller and a really charming, warm man to be around the few times that I met him. And yes, one time in London over a few drinks, I did press upon him my battered paperback copy of I Was Dora Suarez, his darkest book, and I got him to sign it for me. And I'm trying to think what the inscription was. It was something like, to Ian, lots of love, Robin. Robin Cook, his real name. I just thought, yeah, I know that sounds like you've written a romantic novel, man. I mean,
He probably thought it
this is,
was.
this
Yeah.
is the antithesis of the romantic novel.
Well, what about William McIlvanney? Obviously a big important person for Scottish crime fiction, and you finished his last manuscript. Is that right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, William McIlvanney was hugely important to me when I started thinking about writing crime fiction, because I was still coming from a literary tradition. I was doing a PhD in Muriel Spark. I thought I was going to teach English at university all my life, and write literary fiction. McIlvanney was a literary novelist. He'd been shortlisted for literary prizes. He had written poetry and prose, reviews, political journalism, and just great short stories. And then he wrote three crime novels. He wrote about a Glasgow cop called Laidlaw, and the first one was 1979. And I started thinking of writing crime fiction about 81, 82, and so I started to read his books. And then I got the chance to meet him in 1985, I think, at the Edinburgh Book Festival. Again, I took a book with me, and he signed it to me. I said, though, I'm writing a book that's a little bit like your Laidlaw series, but yours are set in Glasgow, mine are set in Edinburgh. And he inscribed the book, Good Luck with the Edinburgh Laidlaw, thinking I'll never see this guy again. I mean, at that time, I hadn't published anything. I hadn't started writing the first Rebus book. And then later on I was published, I got a little bit better known, and we became friends and we did events together. And his books fell out of favor and fell out of print. And then they were brought back into print, and it was a bit of a cause célèbre because all the Scottish crime writers said he was a huge influence on us. And so we did events together, and it was lovely. The third act of his life was lovely. He was rediscovered as a crime writer, and he loved it. And then he died, and lockdown happened, and I'm sitting in lockdown, and I get a note from his widow, Siobhan, and she said, Willie left all these notes. He was planning to write two more Laidlaw books, a prequel and a sequel. And would you take a look at all these notes and see if you think there's a novel there? So I sifted through a couple of hundred pages of ramblings. There were just all kinds of, his mind was sparked in all kinds of different ways. There were bits of conversations, characters, you weren't sure if they connected or not. Was this one story or two stories, one book or two books? Anyway, I was actually thread together something. And I said, yeah, I think we could just about get a novel out of this. Or somebody could. And she said, well, I want you to try. I want you to be the first to give it a go. And I mean, it was a huge responsibility, but it was lockdown. I had nothing else to do. If she'd maybe asked me on, when it wasn't COVID times, I might have said no, because it was a huge responsibility. So then I read and reread and reread the Laidlaw books, and got maps of Glasgow because I didn't really know Glasgow that well. And the prequel was going to be set in 1972. I was 12 years old, so I didn't know much about the world at that time. So I got the local newspaper for Glasgow. I got a year's worth, January to December 72, to see what was happening in Glasgow and in the world at that time, what was on TV, what kind of cars did people drive, that kind of stuff. And I wrote it, trying for his voice. And his voice was difficult to capture because it's very, not florid, but it's quite poetical. It's much more poetical, filled with kind of metaphors and similes than the Rebus books. Anyway, I did it and I sent it off to her, and she wrote me a lovely handwritten letter that said, Ian, you know, she said, I sat for a weekend in our living room reading the manuscript, and it was as though Willie was sitting next to me. You brought him back to me for a weekend, and I want to thank you for that. And that was hugely moving. And actually saying it to you again, it is hugely moving. And I felt, well, job done, Ian. If Willie's widow likes what you've done, you should be proud.
You know, we did conversations all the way through Zoom, you and I and Patrick,
Yeah.
and you were one of the few writers that actually found it to be a very productive period. Remember, we talked about that because you had time, you were doing all kinds of projects that,
Yeah.
yeah.
The play that's touring the UK just now, Rebus, a game called Malice, which is a sort of pun on the
Sound like
Jam
Alice.
song, yeah, with the town called Alice, but also the Jam song, town called Malice. That was written during lockdown. It's a very much a lockdown play. I thought when people come out of lockdown, if they do go back to the theatres, they're going to want to get in and out quick. Theatres are not going to have a lot of money, so they're going to want to put in plays with very few scene changes and very few actors. So it's 6 actors in a single room. They never leave that room. So it's quite claustrophobic, like lockdown was. And there's no scene changes. It's just that one room for 2 acts. I wanted a break. I wanted a break between acts because theatres make their money from the bar. They don't make their money from bums on seats. So I did that, and it's been going great. And it's like you're in and out of the theatre in 2 hours. You know, it's under 2 hours with an interval. So you can be, you know, you go into the theatre at 7:30, you can be in bed by 10. And I don't know about you guys, but as I get older, that's kind of what I want from a night out, is that I can be back in bed by 10 o'clock.
You're so right. It does become harder. I have always wanted to ask you, why did you write some books as John Harvey? Or was it
Jack Harvey. Why did I do? Yeah, I wish I'd written John Harvey's books because they were pretty good.
They were very good. And
yeah.
Patrick and I were really fond of John Harvey. And
John's still with us, God bless him. I don't know if he's still writing or not. I've not seen anything.
I haven't seen a book from him in a really long time.
He had some health issues a while ago. I don't know how he's doing. Why did I write as Jack Harvey? I was young and I was making no money from the Rebus novels, and I was married and kids were coming along, and I needed to make money. And my publisher wasn't selling enough copies of the Rebus books to be interested in 2 Rebus books a year. So I thought, well, I need to write a Rebus book and one other book a year. I'll do something different. So I'll become a huge thriller writer, you know, Freddie Forsyth or Alistair MacLean or that, and I'll sell by the truckload in airports. And I'll change my name to Jack Harvey so that no one buys them thinking they're getting a Rebus novel. And Jack is my first son's name. Harvey is my wife's surname. So I thought it's great. And also, usually in bookstores, H is at eye level. The letter H is at eye level. And so I thought, great, I'll be at eye level. And maybe drunk Jack Higgins fans will buy them, or drunk John Harvey fans will buy them, thinking they're getting their favorite writer, and they're actually getting me. So for lots of reasons. And after 3 books, and I enjoyed writing them. And after 3 books, I was making just about enough money from the Rebus novels that I didn't have to write 2 books a year anymore. So I stopped. Okay. And now, if I do get an idea for a thriller, a standalone, I don't feel the need to use a pseudonym. I think readers are clever enough to know what they're getting. They'll know if it's a Rebus book. They'll know if it's a non-Rebus book. So I wouldn't go back to Jack Harvey again.
Well, thank you. I've always been kind of curious about it because, as I said, I got to know you through, you know, the Jack Harvey books that Diana ordered. So tell us a bit before we go to questions, what's going on with the TV? Because, you know, one of the things we talked about some time ago was that the original dramatizations tried to do an entire book, and, you know, and it was so compressed that
Yeah.
you didn't like it. And I remember saying to you, why don't you just buy the rights back, Ian, and do it all over again? So is that what you did?
Yep, pretty much. Um, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of interest in Rebus right from the get-go when the first book was published, and as a young writer, I was very excited, but nothing ever quite happened. Actors were interested, the BBC were interested, and it just never quite happened. And then it went very quiet. And then a youngish actor called John Hannah came along, and he said he had a production company. He was very interested in trying to do Rebus for TV. And the TV company said, okay, we'll give you the money to make this if you promise to pay to play the character. So John Hannah got it put on TV, and then he went off to Hollywood to do some Hollywood stuff. And the TV companies persuaded an actor called Ken Stott to take it on. And fans were pretty pleased with that. But what they did was they took the John Hannah ones were 2 hours, including ad breaks. The Ken Stott ones, they decided to take down to an hour, including ad breaks, which is 45 minutes. So it's a 45-page script, and they tried to fit a whole novel in,
Right.
which was just, madness. So they would take the title of one of my books and then just write a brand new story to fit it into that 45-minute slot because they knew they couldn't fit the novel in there. I never watched them, but my wife watched Noughts and Crosses, and she said to me, she said, so the plot was completely different. And I said, oh, how would I know? I never read the scripts or watch it. She said the plot was completely, just they used the title and then had a completely different plot. So then it fell into abeyance for a long time. And then a production company said we're very interested in trying to bring Rebus back. And a screenwriter came on board, a screenwriter I really like. I've known him for years. He's a playwright originally. He's from the same part of Scotland as me, similar background, working class. We write about similar themes of masculinity and the crisis of masculinity and all that kind of stuff. Gregory Burke, his name is. And so he came on board. And it was Gregory who said, look, I really think we need a serious reboot. What we do here is we take a young Rebus. So he's virile. He can get in fights. He's macho. He's not the 70-year-old Rebus you're writing about now, Ian. But we put him in the present day because Gregory Burke, I'm very interested in writing about contemporary issues, political issues, social issues. And I went, well, fans might find that a bit of a joke, but let's give it a go. And that's what we did. And we got a great actor from Outlander, bringing us back to Diana Gabaldon, Richard Rankin. Rankin, not his real surname. His real name, I think, is Richard Harris, but of course, there's an actor called Richard Harris, so he changed his name. Everybody thinks it's nepotism. They think he's my nephew. We play up on that online, but he's not, no relation. And he came on and he was just superb. I mean, he was charismatic and I cannot take my eyes off him when he's on the screen. I really can. And the production company said, we want long form. So they gave enough money for us to make it as 6 hours to tell one story. Great, terrific. And it mashes up bits from different books. I mean, Malcolm Fox is in it, Siobhan Clarke is in it, Rebus, of course, is in it, Cafferty, the gangster, is in it. But crucially, this is the one thing that Greg Burke picked up on. He said, Ian, you threw away Rebus's brother far too cheaply. He's in the first 3 or 4 books and he just disappears. He said the relationship between those two brothers is absolutely key. They love each other, they hate each other, they might destroy each other, they might save each other. So Michael Rebus is here in a big part of the story. And I just loved it. I just loved what Gregory Burke did with that. And the acting was great and everything. Anyway, the production money came from Sweden. It was a streaming service. And then they decided that they really don't want to do drama after all. They want to concentrate on sport. So now, although it went on the BBC here in the UK, we're trying to get some co-production money. So we need another co-producer to take over from them so that we can make some more. And we would love to make season 2 because Greg had 2 seasons in mind. He had a story arc that would take 2 seasons to tell. And so season 1 ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. And we really need that second season to explain what happens next.
Got it. Well, I hope that eventually that will come to pass. On that note, Patrick, I'm turning this over to you for either questions
Sure,
or questions
sure.
from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, so much, so much of Rebus, especially, is this kind of his worldview, which, over the series, obviously, as he gains more experience, there's that wonderful kind of melancholia.
Mhm.
How is that is as a younger version, is there hints of that? What am I trying to say? Does he accurately capture that internal part of Rebus, you think, or is it a different sort of beast?
On the TV,
Yeah,
yeah, I think he does. I
yeah.
think he does capture that. I think he's got that because again, also in the TV series, we've got Rona, his ex-wife, and his daughter Sammy, who's about 12 years old in this iteration. And he's very keen. Rebus is very keen for them to get back together again, but it's maybe never going to happen. So you've got all of that going on. He's been saddled with a new associate, Siobhan Clark. She's quite close to this guy, Malcolm Fox, who's internal affairs, who wants to bring Rebus down. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of human drama going on before we even get to the gangster stuff. Because there's a kind of gangland war going on that Rebus and his brother both get caught up on in different ways. It's a really meaty piece of storytelling, but it's human drama. It's not a who done it, really. But then the Rebus books, I mean, the who done it element is never, to me, never the most important part. I mean, okay, it's part that a lot of crime fans love. They love the who done it. They love working it out or being tricked into not working it out. Um, but for me, these have been human dramas throughout, and stories of bad decisions that people make, or why people do terrible things, or what drives them to do terrible things, and what the consequences are of crime, not just to the individuals involved, but to society as a whole. So all of that is in there, and I think he's done a heck of a job, heck of a job, and I do hope he gets to do season two. By the way, there's another thing that I'm trying to juggle at the moment, Patrick. This is especially for you. I've got a double album coming out, a double LP coming out, which is called Behind the Counter. And it's a record label in England called Rough Trade. And they did it once before with a musician called Max Richter. And what they do is they get somebody to come along and say, okay, say you worked in a record store. If somebody walked into your store, what kind of stuff would they hear playing?
Oh,
And you
wow.
go, wow, come on, I'm in heaven. So they were going to do a single album, but I gave them too many good songs. So it's going to be a double album. It's going to come out at the end of late November. So I'm putting together a few events that I'm doing for that as well. So maybe one of these days you can walk into your local record store, if such a thing still exists, and you can have a look, and there will be Ian Rankin behind the counter. And it'll be a
Wow.
26-track double album of some of my favorite tunes.
How cool is that? And then
That is cool.
you were involved in that Rory Gallagher project too, right? With
Yeah, actually, weirdly, you mentioned Rory Gallagher because just today I got an email from his brother saying, "Oh, there's an auction of Rory's guitars
Oh my,
happening in London at some big auction house in London. I mean, he's absolute classic guitars and amplifiers and other bits and pieces. Would you like to come along to the viewing? We're having a private viewing. I can't go; it's like 500 miles away. But yeah, Rory Gallagher. I mean, his brother got in touch with me and said, "Oh, Rebus listens to a lot of this great Irish guitarist, Rory Gallagher, who died far too young. Are you a fan?" I went, "Yeah, I'm a fan, Rory Gallagher." He said, "Well, I'm trying to do this album because Rory was a huge fan of crime fiction. He loved golden age American crime fiction, especially private detectives and stuff. He's got one song called "The Continental Op," right? Dashiell Hammett.
Great.
He said, I'm going to put this album together of his songs and tunes that are specifically crime related. Would you like to get involved, maybe do a short story or something? So I wrote a short story for it that took in as many lines and threads and themes from Rory's crime songs as I could possibly jam in there. And that was a lot of fun to do. Um, and that was great. I mean, give me an interesting, quirky project and I'm there.
one of the things I wanted, Barbara, you'll remember this during lockdown, were just the surreal photographs that you shared with us of Edinburgh during lockdown and the empty streets. And What was that? I mean, what was that experience like? It seems like that could have been like a life-changing experience, for you and your city.
Yeah, it was a once in a lifetime experience. I mean, where we live is a lot of overseas students and rental properties like short-term rentals, Airbnb type properties. So we had the place to ourselves. We had our building. We were the only people in our building for 6 months. And you'd be going up and down the elevator, or you'd be taking the stairs, and it was like it was haunted. I could hear steps behind me. There was nobody there. Um, and then eventually we were allowed out for an hour a day for exercise. And because very few people live in the centre of Edinburgh, you'd walk or cycle around there. You'd be the only people. The main shopping street, like you'd be cycling down it at 5 p.m. on a Friday night, and there was nothing. There was nobody. It was extraordinary. And I got some very febrile ideas for stories, I'll tell you, about what could be happening. Any heists. I mean, what a great idea for a heist, right? All these jeweler shops, hotels, empty, boarded up. Any number of heists could have been happening. And inside my head, they were. Um, but it was strange times. I'm not sure I'd like to repeat the experiment. I mean, it was an experiment in social control to a certain way, to a certain extent,
So you're
how
only,
happy were we to go along with this, and how much good did it do? I think we were always allowed out for a little bit, but it came a point where they said, okay, you can take 1 hour. You weren't allowed to go more than 5 or 8 miles
from
from
your
home.
home.
Yeah, and you were only
Right.
allowed to go for an
Val
hour.
McDermott wrote a really good, I think it was a Karen Perry book, and I'm going blank on it, but she wrote a really amazing book about what it was like during lockdown as one of her crime
Yeah,
novels,
yeah.
which I thought was a tremendous contrast, Patrick, between our experience and
mm,
what it was like, to be, I mean, Phoenix isn't really urban. So, it's an entirely different thing.
Yeah, but I mean, you would have noticed it if there was no cars, right? I mean, if
We
you're,
did notice that, but we were out walking, taking the dogs out, going, to do stuff all the time. It was really, in many ways, it was very peaceful because the congestion, the American
no
curse
smoke.
of the car, was largely eradicated. And because we have a small staff, which means no more than 14 people, we
Yeah.
were allowed to stay open even
Wow.
though we didn't have customers. The staff was able to go to work and do
I
all.
think I think bookstores were always allowed to stay open. Um, they were seen as being, essential shops.
Right.
So supermarkets could stay open and bookstores could stay open. But what they had to do was you had to order books, you phoned them up or whatever, and they left them on their doorstep and you picked them up. So there was no actual interaction.
Well, we did that, and
Yeah.
as we really
Same thing
got
here.
into streaming, which is
Yeah.
our primary. It really expanded our customer base and made
But
it
but
national.
you know that because this all happened during my 60th birthday, and I had these huge, grandiose plans for my 60th birthday. I was going to rent a cinema and take all my friends to the cinema. I was going to take all my friends to a gig. I was going to have a huge dinner. Tons of things were going to happen. Lockdown. So during lockdown, my 60th birthday, 1 hour allowed outdoors. So I got a glass and I got a can of beer, one in one pocket, one in the other pocket, and I basically ran to the Oxford bar, which took me about 20 minutes. And I got there, it was locked up, of course, shuttered. I stood outside, opened the can, poured the beer into the glass, drank the beer, put the glass in the can back in my pocket, and ran home again. That was my 1 hour of exercise on my 60th birthday.
Wow. Well, it was, I think everybody had a different experience depending on your temperament, your age, your living situation, all
We
kinds
did
of.
so many jigsaws. You wouldn't believe how many jigsaws we did.
Yes, I would. We have a friend who brought us jigsaws. We did a lot of things like that. Patrick, are there any questions from the audience?
yeah,
We'll probably give them a shot before they all go away.
well, somebody I think from your area, possibly Ian, Dumbarton, is that, am I saying
Yeah,
that
yeah.
correctly?
Yeah,
Uh,
near Glasgow.
they're just kind of adding some, some experience about this. They say, yeah, there were fines for sitting on a or where is it? Fines for sitting on a park bench.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they taped up park benches and stuff, so you couldn't sit on a park bench. And yeah, police would stop people and say, "Why are you sitting on this bench?" I mean, if you paused during your hour of recreational walking, they would, if two of you got together for a cup of coffee, they'd be going, no, no, you've got to walk, 3 meters apart or whatever. It was just crazy. It was a
Handmaid's
crazy
Tale
time.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Robin also says, seeing the Golden Gate Bridge empty during a beautiful day was eerie.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
then,
we were like, I mean, I took a lot, you're right, I took a lot of photographs of this empty Edinburgh. And my son just gave me a gift for my, I think it was for my birthday this year. And a guy had done a book of photographs. I mean, a really good photographer had done a book of photographs of different areas of Edinburgh during lockdown. Just completely, like the castle, nobody there. Princess Street, nobody there. Hotels boarded up, extraordinary stuff. And it just brings it all back. What a weird, weird, weird time it was. But my God, did I drink a lot of good wine.
Oh,
yeah,
good.
friends in LA, writers that we were talking to at the time. I remember Walter Mosley, for instance. He was saying it's incredible seeing the freeways in Los Angeles empty
Yeah.
and how quickly, the air was starting to clear up.
Yeah.
Some of this,
I mean, they said that about Venice. They said Venice suddenly that you could see fish and stuff in the waters because there was no pollution, because there was no river traffic or no water traffic.
Yeah.
And so marine life started to reappear in the waters of Venice. I mean, that kind of stuff, you go, wow, if we as a species died out tomorrow, the Earth would recreate itself in wonderful myriad ways. It would be lovely to see, except none of us would be here to see it.
Very true.
I know. And I say that as a guy who takes Earth-killing cruises for his holidays, for his vacation.
the same person from Dumbarton, is that right? Says
Yep.
they saw the play and it was a great night out.
Anything
I've
else?
got now, Patrick, this one's for you. I've got half a feeling, but I'd have to check this, that Talking Heads lead guy David Byrne was born in Dumbarton.
Really?
I think his mum is from Dumbarton, and there's a film, and is it Something Wild? Is a
Hmm.
movie by Jonathan Demme,
I saw that.
and David Byrne's mum has a cameo in that film, and she's got the broadest Glaswegian style accent you'll ever hear.
I'll be darned.
There you go.
Let's see. Um,
Barbara's going, what?
somebody's asked, are there any up and coming Scottish writers that we may not have heard of here that you'd like to mention? Anybody you can think of?
There will be, but I don't get to read everybody. I mean, I'm limit. I read maybe a book a week, and I get sent maybe 12 or 20 books a week by publishers who would like me to say nice things about them. Scottish, none are coming to mind immediately, and I'm sorry about that. I'm embarrassed about that. If I've thought for 10, 15 minutes, I'm sure I could find lots. But the last great, and he's not an unknown writer, but the last great novel I read this year was by a guy called Dominic Nolan, who's an English novelist. And he's written a novel. It's not quite out yet. It's coming out in the UK in November, called White City.
Hmm.
And it's basically as close to the Elroy of the LA Quartet, but set in 1950s London, that you'll ever get. So he's got the style of early James Elroy, classic James Elroy, but it's very much about London. There's real gangsters in there, real characters, real events, beautifully written, big fat book that is a great read.
Is White
So
City where the track? Isn't there?
yeah, White City is a part of London where there's a dog track, a dog racing track and
I
stuff.
know it by way of Shane McGowan.
There you go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There you go. Anyway, that was that. I really enjoyed that book. And then there's a guy, I think, is it called Simon Mason? Someone turned me on to a writer called Simon Mason who couldn't be more different. And again, a youngish English writer who almost writes. I mean, Patrick, I think you might like this because it's got a kind of slight Derek Raymond vibe to it.
What's his name?
His name, I think, is Simon Mason. Is
Hmm.
the book is called something like Missing Person, and in a colon, Alice. He's written 3 or 4 crime novels, very slim, very French, very nouveau roman, but really, really good. And on the front, the reason I read the book, The Power of the Blurb, he had a blurb on the front of the book, one from Mick Herron and one from David Peace.
Oh.
And I thought, okay, that's my Venn diagram right there. You know, if these guys like you, I'm going to have some of that.
Let's see.
I'm going to check his name now because I'm sure it's Simon Mason. I just want to double check. Whenever I read the book now, because I'm a man of a very small memory, I have to make a little note of it. I've got notes in my phone, and so whenever a newspaper says, "What are your books of the year, your records of the year, your gigs of the year, your films of the year," I just go back to my little list of everything I've read, everything I've seen, everything I've listened to, and I can compile my best of the year list. And he was, yeah, Simon Mason. Simon Mason, Missing Person Alice.
Alice, A-L-I.
Alice. She's a girl who's gone missing.
Yeah.
A little bit like the plot in my new book.
So, Patrick, are there any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, we should probably wrap it up. Sorry. Well,
I've been here, you know, I'm been here a lot. This is 10 o'clock at night, my time, for God's sake. I've been here a long time.
That's you're waiting.
I'm taking a train to London tomorrow for a festival, you know.
Wow. Somebody's asking, what are you drinking?
Oh, that's a great question. I am drinking. This is probably not allowed. It's probably advertising. It's a whiskey, a malt called Glengoyne.
Mm.
Now, what's special about that is if you can see the branding there, the insignia.
Bloody Scotland.
Bloody Scotland. So that's the Bloody Scotland Crime Fiction Festival, which happens in Stirling every year.
Right.
And they give the authors who take part a bottle of scotch. So 10-year-old Glengoyne, Highland single malt. My name is there just above Bloody Scotland. So they even print your name out on the label. Thanks from all at Bloody Scotland. More festivals should do this.
That's true.
It beats the hell out of a canvas tote bag, right?
That's really nice. Right.
It beats a tote bag.
Well, we're going to have to let the aging Ian Rankin, whose
really, tell me
time
about
is
it.
rapidly approaching here or already passed, we're going to have to let him go. The joy of talking to Ian is that one could do it for hours. It's so hard to give it up. Anyway, Midnight in Blue out next week in the UK and simultaneously here in the US. You're going to show.
Let's do the advertising. Let's do that.
There they are. Okay.
UK and US editions.
Got it.
And we should mention, Barbara, that we are getting signed copies of the British edition.
In fact, Ian has signed them and they're getting ready to ship, I think. So
I signed a lot at Goldsboro. Will that be your lot?
Right. That's it. Right. So thank you very much for doing that. And for all of you watching, you definitely want to grab a signed copy, as Ian is not coming to the US for this book. So this is the only way you're going to get one. Right. So thank you all very much. And Ian, I'll talk to you in a second. And Patrick, say goodbye to everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for watching, folks.
Let me see. So what I don't want to do here is, all right, now hold on a second.
Do not delete the record.
No, but I can end the stream.
Yeah, that's what we need to do.
Okay.